was having an affair with this guy. He even admitted to the operator that it was a friend.
Yes, what happened was, when we talk about these things, we've been zapped tonight. It's so incredible, and we're just trying to show you how easily it can be to get taken down. But like I was saying, as we are beginning these presentations here for the 9/11 debate night this Saturday, and as I was miming there, and I hope you could read lips. It's part of the training around here, but one of the bright things to come out of one of the darkest days of 9/11 were the organizations that derived from that to bring us what we now know as the truth movement. And truthfully, they were quite an inspiration that was way above stream of of just politics at that time. And one of those organizations, like Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, is Scholars for 9/11 Truth. And one of the founders is here tonight. He's going to make our night 2 of debates, presentations. He's going to make the case for it. So let's welcome to the stage the one, the only, Jim Fetzer. Jim, hope to God you can hear me.
Dean, I can. I'm here to explain that 9/11 was a made-for-TV movie. The screenwriters, however, were not rocket scientists, such that some of the most powerful proofs are violations of the laws of physics and of aerodynamics, which cannot be violated and cannot be changed. And, as I shall explain, the bottom line, Israel attacked America on 9/11 with the complicity of the CIA and the neocons in the Department of Defense. Let's go back to that tragic and fateful day. If you were watching MASH, for example, you might have found your program was disrupted, just as occurs here.
Okay, so we're going to start the presentation, Jim, and so buckle up, everybody, and if there's any tech issues, it wasn't me or Jim, I can assure you that. So let's get started with Jim's presentation, and founder of the Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and both of these guys are great, so let's get to it. Here we go, Jim.
Thank you,
Made-for-TV
Dean.
movie.
9/11 was a made-for-TV movie. The screenwriters, however, were not rocket scientists. Some of the most important proofs are repeated violations of the laws of physics and of aerodynamics, which, as laws of nature, cannot be violated and cannot be changed. The bottom line, Israel attacked America on 9/11 with the complicity of the CIA and the neocons in the Department of Defense. If you were at home that fateful day and perhaps watching a rerun of MASH, here's how the show was interrupted and the reporting you would have watched at the time, that very day.
No second plane. It was a bomb. Bomb in another building, not second plane. That was a bomb. Who said the second plane?
That's what we're told. The second plane. We saw it on television.
Everything.
All right. Thanks a lot. This is.
Idea of how much of the plane actually impacted the building.
You know, it might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in. And as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later that the structure was weakened enough that all of the floors collapsed.
Jeff, it's a United Airlines plane. It's believed to be at that site outside Pittsburgh, isn't it?
That's exactly right, John, with 45 people total on board. And one of the more profound things today, the imprint of terrorism seared not only on Wall Street, but also on Main Street. Here you have an area 80 miles to the southeast of Pittsburgh, and this plane, which went down at about 10 o'clock this morning. We have rescue vehicles that came in earlier in the day, and they have turned up nothing. No one believed to be alive from this crash. Some of the media just getting back to the scene, which is about a quarter of a mile up on a hill back behind me. And so some of the first pictures just starting to come in within the last hour. I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago. And Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there. No smoke, no fire. Just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
You couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
Says that City Hall in Oakland will remain open. It will be business as usual. He is urging people to remain calm given what is going on, remain calm. Oakland City Hall will remain open, but in San Francisco, City Hall has been closed. We're also just getting word here now that a second United Airlines jet, Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles, is now missing. Again, if you're just joining us, there have been 4 separate plane crashes. 3 of those planes were en route to California. 2 were heading to LAX. The 3rd was heading to San Francisco International Airport.
That was specifically the one heading to SFO, United Flight number 93 from Newark to SFO. It apparently crashed in Pennsylvania, fairly close to the border of Maryland and not too far from Camp David. Why is that significant? Because one of the groups possibly claiming responsibility for all these terrorist attacks is the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And it was this week in 1978 that the Camp David Accords were reached. Is there a connection? At this point, we don't know, but it is important to be aware of that situation. In Washington, D.C., many congressional leaders have been transferred to a secret location. Some senators have described this as a second Pearl Harbor. And President Bush was in Florida this morning, but he made a brief announcement when the first attacks were clear on the World Trade Center, and he was heading back to Washington, D.C. At this point, we don't know exactly where he is. They're not really broadcasting that information, but we are told that the president is safe right now.
We're waiting for a press conference to start in San Francisco from the Office of Emergency Services to discuss what the situation, what the city's reaction to all of this is going to be. But again, right now in San Francisco.
Well, the Israelis tend to go a stage too far to blame the Palestinians. Thus, they just happen to have at hand footage showing Palestinians rejoicing, which I immediately recognized to have been from a previous religious or political event. They were, in fact, just as slack-jawed and dumbfounded as the rest of the world at these developments. Meanwhile, we're given a scenario of flight patterns, which is complete fantasy. The truth of the matter is, I shall demonstrate 2 of those planes were not even in the air that day, and the other 2 were still in the air after it had allegedly crashed. It is true, however, that ICTS, which is, surprise, surprise, an Israeli firm, was providing security at the airports involved. No plane theory can be defined as a conjunction of 4 planes. That Flight 93 did not crash in Shanksville. That Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon Plus. That Flight 11 did not hit the North Tower, and that Flight 175 not hit the South. I shall prove each of these. Turning initially to Shanksville, you heard the description. It was a hole in the ground about 15 or 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Well, the aircraft, there's no signs of debris whatsoever. Both of the reporters on the scene at the time said the eerie aspect of the crash site was there was no sign any plane had crashed there, which is because no plane had crashed there. Compare Missouri, Amsterdam, Russia. Real crashes with massive debris from a 110 airliner. 9/11 Shanksville, no. So here you have Chris Kanicki making that very point. Thus, there are those who insist the reason we can't see a plane is because it is an area where mining had taken place and it had disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft. But frankly, that's absurd. The plane had a wingspan of 125 feet. It had a tail that stood 40 feet above the ground. Had it disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft, we know what to do with miners who are trapped underground. We break out the bright lights on the heavy equipment and dig 24/7 in the hope that perhaps one of them might have survived. That did not happen in Shanksville. Even to retrieve the bodies who are purportedly buried there, 45 on a plane that could carry 289. We also have a Val McClitchy photograph on the left. That is an oddity allegedly taken at the time. But you notice the smoke. It's not that characteristic of plane crashes, which is dark black as you see on the right. It looks more like that from an explosion set off in the middle. Plus, the photograph would have the plane situated over a pond, the wrong location for it to have taken place. Here's a real plane crash, the real smoke you ought to have seen had it really happened. Meanwhile, pilots for 9/11 Truth, which turned out to have done absolutely superb work on the crash site, discovered that Flight 93 was still airborne after it officially crashed in Shanksville and was over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. As I shall subsequently explain, it was not even taken out of service until 28 September 2005, 4 years later. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, we only got 5 frames that were released, 4 of them here, one conveniently labeled plane. We have a fireball growing in these. It's been noticed from the beginning. They have the wrong date timestamp, and the events appear to be fictional rather than real. I asked a dear friend, Jack White, if he could model a Boeing 757 to the scale of the tail of the vehicle seen here. And when he did, notice it's more than twice as large as what we have in the frame. Plus, pilots and aeronautical engineers have explained this white exhaust is not what you get from the jet, the exhaust of a jet approaching a building, but rather from a missile being fired from a plane. And guess what? We actually have a video of the missile being fired. I looked for it on YouTube. It's not there. I had to go to Yandex. Look at it in the lower right. There you see the missile fired into the Pentagon at the lower right. Watch it again. One more time. There it is. That's what hit the Pentagon. Had nothing to do with an airplane. Here's the official crash site, however. It's about 10 feet high and 15 feet wide. There are chain link fence, couple of automobiles on fire, 2 large rolls of cable, and unbroken windows. What we do not see here is a massive pile of aluminum debris from a 100-ton airliner. No bodies, no seats, no luggage, no wings, no tail. Not even the engines were recovered. As Jamie McIntyre explained, the part of the building did collapse 45 minutes later. I believe Donald Rumsfeld felt that the apparent damage wasn't sufficient, so he had that undertaken. Now, when they did the excavation, notice no signs of an intense fire. We even have here a stand for what I take to have been an Oxford Unabridged Dictionary. But notice, there's no sign of the fire that was shown in those frames, the 5 frames, which suggests to me they were added later for theatrical effect. According to the official account, the plane approached the building at over 400 miles an hour, barely skimming the ground. This turns out to be an aerodynamical impossibility because of the phenomenon known as ground effect That plane, flying at over 400 miles an hour, could not have got closer than 60 or even 80 feet to the ground, which is higher than the Pentagon at 71 feet is tall. Meanwhile, lime green civilian fire trucks in the area moved in to extinguish the very modest fires. Even more notable, notice the Pentagon lawn, absolutely bereft of any debris. No signs of any plane having crashed there. Once again, for the obvious reason, because no plane had crashed there. We have other visions. This is from the BBC. When they did a report on 9/11, you got the clean Pentagon lawn, no debris. Here's another. Even after the section of the building has collapsed, the Pentagon lawn is perfectly clear and free of debris. Now, it eventually began showing up long after. The most conspicuous was this piece, which is fuselage from a Boeing 757. But notice, it's as though it was peeled off the fuselage, not as though it was involved in a violent collision that would crumple it up. No signs of having been exposed to intense fire. And notice here, entwined is a piece of vine, not indigenous to the Arlington, Virginia area. Well, James Hansen, who's an attorney for Columbus, Ohio, was intrigued by the vine and pursued research on crashes of 757, which have been very few and far between. He discovered one had occurred near Cali, Columbia in 1995, American Airlines 965, where the pilots lost their way and crashed through jungle into the side of a mountain where these vines appear in abundance. Guess what? An Israeli salvage team did the research. I suggested that the debris might have been dropped from a C-130 that was circling the Pentagon. So BBC reached out to the pilot and asked him if that was the case, which he denied. He said it was absurd, but it would have been too awkward to have officers and men bring pieces of fuselage onto the lawn. Meanwhile, according to the official trajectory, the plane, barely skimming the ground, hit a series of stationary lampposts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, because of Newton's third law, a plane at over 400 miles an hour hitting stationary lampposts would have the same effect as if the plane had been stationary and hit by lampposts traveling over 400 miles an hour. They would have ripped open the wings where the fuel is stored. It would have mixed with air, burst into flame. It would have cartwheeled across the lawn. There would have been debris everywhere, but it wasn't there. Meanwhile, the citizens investigative team discovered there were witnesses at a Citgo station near the Pentagon who reported seeing a plane fly toward the Pentagon and then witnessed an explosion. Each of them gave the gold line description. What's crucial here, that's not the official trajectory identified by the green. It is too far north. These are not the same plane. Norman Mineta actually gave testimony to the 9/11 Commission about Dick Cheney instructing this plane approaching the Pentagon to not be shot down. That was, of course, odd. The obvious thing to do would have been to shoot it down. Then you would lose the passengers in the plane, yes, but you would not also lose the property and the personnel at the target. Now, it just happens that a friend of mine from JFK Research, Roy Schaefer, had a friend, Dave Ball, who is a trucker, in front of the Pentagon at the time. Dave told Roy that a plane had approached the Pentagon and then swerved over it at the same time an explosion took place. swerved over it. I told Roy, let's get Dave on the air to secure his report to make him safe. But Roy explained he was reluctant to do so. And the next time I spoke with Roy, he reported that Dave had been found dead in an abandoned.
Wow.
He knew.
Wow.
He knew.
Jim, that's crazy. If I have just a quick question is why do we think they what's the significance of Shanksville and the Pentagon? Why were those particular sites part of the 9/11 event? What is your thesis on that?
Well, they had to hit the Pentagon. Otherwise, it was only an act of terrorism and not an act of war, and therefore would not have justified a military response. But they hit the wing of the Pentagon that had been revived. It had been reconstructed to be nuclear resistant, the only wing of the Pentagon to undergo that kind of reconstruction. Shanksville, I think, was so they could promote the idea that a plane had been headed toward the Capitol, as I'm going to explain, but simply never arrived because it allegedly had crashed there. Meanwhile, if you look carefully, it says punch out. The Pentagon has 5 rings, E, D, C, B, A. And in the C ring, we have this very symmetrical hole that is allegedly caused by a landing gear from the aircraft, but it would have hit at an angle. Hitting it at an angle, it would have been asymmetrical. And the punch out, of course, tells us what actually happened. They used cordite, a military explosive, to create a special effect. This was pure theater, Dean, and they were resorting to all the techniques Hollywood can't avail. And remember now, Jamie McIntyre, we heard him say it, the best reporter for CNN. From his close-up inspection, there was no sign of any plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. He was reporting accurately. Later, he was pressured to make a retraction, and he did it in the following way. He said, only a fool would deny that a plane hit the Pentagon, meaning he'd been a fool to think his bosses at the network wanted him to report the truth, and he shortly thereafter retired from CNN, unwilling to carry the heavy water of a lie of this magnitude. Meanwhile, April Gallup, a civilian employee, reported how she brought her infant to work that day, and when she touched her computer, a massive explosion took place, which I take to have been the one Dave Ball witnessed when the other plane flew over the building. She stepped outside through the hole, smelled cordite, but saw no evidence of any plane having been present. Meanwhile, General Albert Stubblebine, who was in charge of all U.S. military intelligence, including signals and photographic, gave an interview in Germany where he explained how he could tell that no plane had hit the Pentagon because it would have made an imprint in the soft limestone that was the Pentagon facade. General Stubblebine would subsequently do an interview with me where I reviewed the evidence for all 4 of the crash sites having fabricated or faked, albeit in different ways. General Stubblebine not only agreed, but offered additional reasons why I was right. Meanwhile, later in the afternoon, billowing black smoke came up from the Pentagon. The representatives in Congress went on the steps, looked across the Potomac, and saw the smoke, which I knew had to be a fabrication because the limestone, the green fire trucks had extinguished the very modest fires and discovered, lo and behold, the fires were coming from a series of dumpsters at the Pentagon, not even from the building itself. Subsequently, a member of scholars would visit me in Duluth and show me 44 more frames from a National Geographic special where you could see daylight between the dumpsters on fire and the building. Another Hollywood special effect. Many will recall the day before, Donald Rumsfeld reported that 2.3 trillion was missing from the Pentagon budget. It was very odd for him to have done that, since giving a big story like that early in the week, it will grow legs. It will build during the week. It's as though he anticipated something traumatic would happen thereafter and be able to waltz in to the halls of Congress the following day and ask for hundreds of billions more in defense spending, which is precisely what happened. We have a pretty good idea where all that money went, because the controller, the chief financial officer of the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, is not only an Israeli, he's a rabbi. And Zakheim had a company that designed remote control apparatus to seize control from airliners should they be subject to hijacking, but which would also enable you to control planes remotely, where I believe the original plan was to use remotely controlled planes to crash into the buildings until they discovered it was physically impossible for real planes to enter the North or the South Tower, and they had to devise a more ingenious scheme. Meanwhile, Edward Hendry, realizing Department of Transportation statistics, keeps records on every commercial carrier in the United States, from the time it's supposed to have departure, from the time it's loaded, from wheels up to wheels down, and publishes those records. Well, guess what? He took a screenshot of the Department of Transportation showing no American airline flight 77 scheduled to depart Washington on 9/11. Thus, no plane theory defined the conjunction of four claims. Flight 93 did not crash in Shanksville. Proven? Yes. Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon. Proven? Yes. Moving forward to New York. These were magnificent buildings. Richard Gage described them well. 110-story marvels of architecture, won many awards. They had 47 massive core columns in the center to create a lot of open space, and then 230 external steel support columns. So they were, in essence, a tube within a tube design, extraordinarily robust. As Chuck Baldwin, a retired high school math, physics, and chemistry teacher, has done diagrams for scholars, the thickness of the steel was enormous at the bottom, 6 inches thick, then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, tapering off. So the top, it was only a 1/4 inch thick. The very idea that that rather modest amount of the mass of the building could bring about a collapse of the lower floors is a physical absurdity. It wasn't even physically possible. Meanwhile, we had the 7 buildings. You have the 2 monstrous twin towers. Building 7, 47 floors, would have been the tallest building in 37 states had it not been surrounded by those behemoths. Meanwhile, asbestos was taking a problem in the twin towers, because when they were constructed beginning in 1966, they were laden with asbestos. And in fact, the Port Authority had issued a directive that the World Trade Center had to deal with the asbestos problem. Well, that was difficult, because if you undertook a classic controlled demolition, it would have released the asbestos particles into the atmosphere, as well as other heavy metals. So that was ruled out. Constructing scaffolding around the building would have been extremely expensive and tedious, running an estimated $1 billion a building. So that was highly undesirable. How convenient that there just happened to be a terrorist attack that would undertake the demolition with no questions asked, where astonishingly EPA director, Christy Whitman, claimed that the air in New York City was safe to breathe. Here you see, it was virtually as though only buildings with a WTC designation were destroyed and nothing else. Meanwhile, the World Trade Center had been transferred into private hands for the first time by the members of Port Authority, all of whom were Zionist, enthusiastic supporters of Israel, including Frank Lowry, Paul Eisenberg, and Ronald Lauder. And to whom did they transfer ownership of the World Trade Center? Larry Silverstein, who's not only Jewish, but a personal friend of Bibi Netanyahu. They spoke on the phone every Sunday. You begin to get the idea what was going on here. And when he took control of the World Trade Center, he immediately changed the security firm from that had been in place since 1970 to an Israeli firm, Kroll. He also revised his insurance policies to include an anti-terrorist clause, claiming that because there'd been 2 planes, 2 attacks, double indemnity, collecting a minimum of $4.5 billion on a $114 million investment. They don't call him Lucky Larry for nothing. Meanwhile, Odago, which was a Jewish messenger service, was telling Jewish employees not to come into the World Trade Center that day. Mayor Willie Brown even admitted he'd been warned that he should not fly on 9/11, where it's eventually been revealed that the person who warned him not to fly was Condoleezza Rice. So, of course, they have sought to secure that information and force him to contradict his earlier statement. So really, are you lying now or were you lying then? I had a little old lady from Brooklyn call me to explain that the rabbi had told the members of her synagogue not to go into Lower Manhattan that day. And she was very concerned knowing that information. And I thanked her so much for sharing. Meanwhile, in relation to Flight 11, there just happened to be a French film crew who called themselves the Naudet brothers on the scene, allegedly investigating the performance of the New York Fire Department in dealing with a glass leak. Now, notice, they heard the plane. Well, when you hear the plane, it's already far gone from the location you would turn to where you heard. But this cameraman just happened to swing his camera up to catch a hit on the North Tower. Now, a Scottish scholar has done an analysis and discovered there were 100 improbable circumstances that had to be satisfied in order for them to have filmed this event. Here's what a Boeing 767 would look like approaching the North Tower. Here, however, is what we can derive from the Naudet brothers' film. Rosalie Grable, known as the Web Fairy, described it as looking like flying pigs. Meanwhile, here's a first hit flash frame. Notice you sort of have a horizontal hit, though it was actually impacting at an angle when we look at the damage to the facade. But while initially it had a Z shape shown on the left, after the smoke cleared, it had an elongated V, and guess what? They even extended the elongated V at the tip of the wing, which would have been extremely fragile. It would have been impossible for this to have happened as a matter of fact. Thus, I believe that the blowout occurred in the background when all the smoke and debris was in the air, and there were lots of twinkling points of light, leading me to speculate whether this is what George H.W. Bush meant when he thought about 1,000 points of light. Meanwhile, here's a diagram of the floors that were intersected by the plane hitting the North Tower. Were real, 7 different floors, each of which consisted of a steel truss connected at one end to the core column, at the other to the external steel core support columns, and filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. Again, Edward Hendry checked out Bureau of Transportation statistics, and guess what? No American airline Flight 11 was scheduled to depart Boston Logan on 9/11. It wasn't even in the air. Meanwhile, there were some hundreds of Israeli art students who were inside the World Trade Center. In fact, over 200 were admitted with visas by the CIA. So what were they doing? Well, there are boxes here of fuse holders. They were doing performance art outside the building. They were actually suspending themselves in space above the building. But I believe that the idea of being art student was just a cover. They were, in fact, Mossad agents, and I believe they were prepping the building for the events that were to come.
Jim, can we come back to that? We have a quick break. I want to come back on the dancing Israeli, if we could. We're going to take this quick break, and if we go over a little bit because of our inefficient beginning there, we will do that, Jim, to make sure you have enough time. So this is great, everybody. We're going to harp back on the dancing Israelis, and the first thing that comes to mind is it true that the wreckage for the Twin Towers went to China? Is that where they shipped it, Jim? Because a lot of this is old, it's coming back to me again.
Yes, Dean, Rudy Giuliani, and it's quite remarkable, had 115 dump trucks lined up to haul away the debris the day after. But what Judy Wood astutely observed was they weren't just hauling away the debris, they were bringing in hundreds of tons of dirt to absorb the radiation residual, just as occurred at Chernobyl. This is just what the Russians did, the Soviets, when they had a meltdown of their nuclear reactor at Chernobyl. They brought in tons and tons of dirt to absorb the radioactivity, about which I shall have more to say.
Yes, okay. We're going to put you on standby there. Standby, Jim Fetzer. Just incredible stuff. It flows just like wine. When we get back here on this 9/11 debate presentation here, night 2, we're going to pick up on just exactly who was dancing and what origin did they derive from, and more of the connection of that origin when we get back with Jim Fetzer's presentation here, night number 2, as the big day is just days away. If I must add again, Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern. You don't want to miss that. Okay, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick, short break. It is 9/11 all over again, isn't it?
Real Deal reports who and what is Ellen DeGeneres based on recent Hollywood revelation, the veil of these once beloved celebrities has faded into irrelevance, like the narrative of the pandemic. And a weird diagram in the background of this photograph is frowned upon with anger and lunacy and not so much fear. We have more about Ellen and the salami, oddly enough. Dean, where do we begin?
Well, I guess we could begin. When I was at Subway the other day, I could have swore my salami sandwich tasted like Ellen because it didn't taste. So that's where it starts and ends.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Real Deal Media's 9/11 debate presentation week, night number 2 of this incredible presentation with Jim Fetzer. As yes, I am still Dean Ryan, and I hope to God the world can hear me because yes, I have so many angelic things to say, just like Jim. But how about this? It is compelling. It is as compelling as the days and the times we were first learning about what really happened that day. And Jim, I got to give you credit. If you just read the live chats all over the place, people are on the edge of their seat, and count me as one of them, people who are definitely on the edge. But where we last left off, let's pick up again. As you were describing the dancing Israelis, and you certainly have made the connection and the case for an Israeli connection, to say the least. So why don't we pick up from there, Jim, if we could?
Well, there's much more to come, Dean. I think if it had not been for the NYPD being all over this, the situation could have been considerably worse. Meanwhile, in Liberty State Park, 5 individuals who are dressed in Arab gear were celebrating, taking high fives while they filmed the destruction of the Twin Towers. A bystander observed them, thought their behavior was very peculiar, and reported them to the police, who apprehended them in a van from Urban Moving Systems, which turned out to be an Israeli asset, and had a painting of a plane and the Twin Towers on the side. When the officer approached the driver, he said, "We're not a problem. Our problem is your problem. The problem is the Palestinians." They searched the vehicle. They found box cutters, residue of explosive passports, and money. They were apprehended for 44 days until Michael Chertoff, then Assistant Attorney General, released them, and they returned to Israel, where 3 of them went on Israeli television and explained they had been there to document the destruction of the Twin Towers, which obviously implied foreknowledge. Michael Chertoff would become the 2nd director of Homeland Security after Tom Ridge, and of course, like so many other key players, is an avid Zionist and a Jew. Meanwhile, we had the phenomenon involving Flight 175, which is by far the most interesting of all the aspects, separate and apart from the mode of destruction of the Twin Towers themselves. There are some 52 videos of Flight 175 approaching the South Tower. In fact, it's taking place at a speed that was aerodynamically impossible. Once again, pilots for 9/11 Truth observed that the speed of a 767 at here, some 450 or more miles an hour, was impossible because the plane would have come apart in the air. They even created a documentary called 9/11 Intercepted. Brilliant piece of work by pilots showing how it was an impossible approach at a speed that was not sustainable for that aircraft at that altitude. They appear to have assumed the cruising speed of a 767 at 35,000 feet could be secured at the much lower level where the air is actually 3 times more dense, so that the turbines can't process and becomes functioning like brakes. In fact, our nation's leading pilot offered an affidavit for the Judy Wood case in New York City, in which he verified that was preposterous, that the plane could not have traveled at that speed at that altitude. John Lear, who held 15 international speed records and was qualified in all areas of aeronautics, including mechanics and maintenance. Meanwhile, we had the entry of the plane into the building with no collision effects. Once again, just as we just witnessed a violation of the laws of aerodynamics, flying possible faster than would have been aerodynamically possible, with a plane entering the building with no collision effects, which is utter physical impossibility. It's caused the plane sometimes to be described as a ghost plane, or the building, or a butter plane, as though the 110-story building was made out of butter as it disappears. Now here, you have that plane intersecting with 8 different floors, just as Flight 11 purportedly was intersecting with 7, each of which consisted of a steel truss connected at one end to the 47 core columns, at the other to the external steel support columns, and filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. The variance because the steel trusses had V-shaped grooves that were 4 inches deep. So in some places it was 4 inches, in others 8, because the buildings were 208 feet on a side. Each floor consists of a steel truss and an acre of concrete. The very idea a plane could have actually entered the building is a physical impossibility. Here we have now, nevertheless, this is from the Evan Fairbanks video taken looking up, where you see the plane passing its entire length into the building in the same number of frames. It passes its entire length in air, which makes sense physically only if a massive 500,000 ton steel and concrete building poses no more resistance to the trajectory of an aircraft in flight than air. And as many observed, we had the very peculiar phenomenon shown at the lower left of the apparent nose out of the plane on the opposite side of the building. When this occurred, those of you who are watching as I was watching witnessed a sudden fade to black. The screen went black, which I dare say is explicable because they committed a colossal blunder they did not want to admit. Here you can actually see what's taking place. Notice the nose out. Now, some wonder this was actually a dust cloud, but I'd say that's rather preposterous because dust is microscopic. You got continuity of the plane. Notice the trajectory. It's continuous in flight to the nose out with no hesitation, no diminution in velocity. I declare dust could not have formed the shape of a nose with that rapidity. It might have eventually, but not. And why would it take the shape of a nose? Meanwhile, Ace Baker, who did a brilliant documentary entitled The 9/11 Opera gives us a diagram of what actually ought to have happened. The plane should have collided with the side of the building, broken into pieces, body, seat, luggage fallen to the ground, parts of the wing, parts of the tail. It would have been impossible to have entered the building. But when we look at the facades beneath the building, what do we find? Nothing. No parts, no bodies, no seats, no luggage, no wings, no tail. It didn't happen. You cannot have a cause without the effects that cause would bring about. Just as at the Pentagon, you cannot have had a plane crash and there to be no debris. Just as at Shanksville, as I say, the scriptwriters were not rocket scientists and they made mistakes. Dean.
Just a quick question to that is Richard Gage made the incredible discovery in his presentation about the melted, molten, I want to say like lava-like substance that was burning for, what was it, a week or two after the event.
Dean,
and would that disintegrate the bodies, do you think?
Dean, we're going to get there, my friend. Just be patient.
Okay, and
we're talking about
and Seth said only a passport. Yeah, they found a passport. You're right, Seth. Go ahead, Jim. Take it away.
Meanwhile, there was an engine found at the intersection of Church and Murray, but it was just sitting on the sidewalk. It was under a canopy, which was undamaged and steel scaffolding. And Jack White, a colleague of mine from 9/11 research, who actually created that image of the Evan Fairfax video, discovered Fox News footage of agents wearing FBI vests unloading something heavy. What's the tell? Well, anything as massive as an engine coming down at high velocity would have destroyed the sidewalk. It would have ripped it off. This is just sitting there. That's totally implausible. It suggests it was put there. The agents in the FBI vest may have even used the dolly in the foreground. But get this, experts have identified this was an antiquated engine. It was not from 767 currently in service. It was a prop, Dean. This is another theatrical touch. So the question becomes, how was it done? Rosalie Grable suggests it was done with CGI, computer-generated images. Ace Baker suggests it was done with video compositing. There's a period of time between when a film is taken and it's actually broadcast, about 17 seconds, during which the image of planes could have been added. The third is the hypothesis that may initially sound far-fetched, that was done using a hologram. Well, what can we say about these hypotheses? Had it been either CGI or video compositing, the only time we would have seen a plane was in the broadcast footage. But during an interview I did with Andrew Johnson, who's an ally of Judy Wood, we reviewed 500 witness reports collated by the New York Times, reporting having seen a plane in real time approaching a building. Their descriptions were highly varied. Some said a large plane, some said a small plane, some said a commercial plane, some said a military plane. But the point is, any observation of a plane prior to broadcast footage invalidates, falsifies the CGI and the video compositing hypotheses. So how could it have been done? Well, Richard D. Hall of the UK solved the problem. You can find his 9/11 Flight 175 radar data 3D analysis online. What he did was to take those many videos. The 52, he found about 27 or 28 were sufficiently specific that he could plot the location of the plane at the time it was approaching the building. When he consulted NIST, he discovered they had a similar plot. They claimed to have been based on radar data. But when he looked at their source, he found it untrustworthy, even incredible. He did discover there actually was radar data, but it was for a plane that was 1,200 feet to the right of the data points that he had plotted. There was nothing there for the actual location of the plots, but there was a path for a real plane 1,200 feet to the side. He inferred what happened is the plane 1,200 feet to the side had projected the image of Flight 175 that accounted for the impossible speed. It was flying faster than a 767. The sound of the plane projecting the image was interpreted as coming from the image itself. It explains the impossible physics because the mirror image wouldn't have any collision effects with a wall that would be impenetrable to a real plane. And the military radar, of course, didn't reflect the projected image because it wasn't a physical object that would, off which radio waves would bounce. So it only reflected the actual plane. This, therefore, was Richard D. Hall's theory, which I endorse. And indeed, I was sent a page from an Australian military manual for an airborne holographic projector. Brief description. The holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. It's also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. And notice, here you have the projection, one plane projecting the image of another, which I submit occurred on 9/11. And get this, pilots for 9/11 Truth tracked the flight of 175 and found it was over Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after it had allegedly hit the South Tower. So once again, we have a fraudulent depiction of a crash site as part of our made-for-TV movie. I would confirm it by obtaining FAA registration records that showed that the actual physical aircraft used for those two flights were not even formally deregistered or taken out of service until 28 September 2005. So I submit, how can planes that weren't even in the air have crashed on 9/11? And how can planes that crashed on 9/11 have still been in the air 4 years later? Thus, no planes theory. Flight 93 did not crash in Shanksville, proven yes. Flight 77 did not hit the Pentagon, proven yes. Flight 11 did not hit the North Tower, proven yes. Flight 175 did not hit the South, proven yes. And notice, Dean, if no planes crashed, then no passengers died, and no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash. And if no Islamic hijackers caused them to crash, then there was no warrant or any justification for the war on terror.
But Jim, we all heard the phone calls from the airplanes that dreadful day. You mean to tell me that those phone calls were not as authentic as they tell us it was?
A.K. Dudney was a computer scientist from Western Ontario in Canada, took 3 types of cell phones and made multiple flights and covered at speeds over 200 miles an hour or altitudes at 2,000 feet, none of them would function because the relay towers couldn't keep up with them fast enough. If you listen carefully to those 9/11 calls, there are plenty of indications they were taped in advance doing a simulated drill and are completely unworthy as evidence. One more Hollywood special effect to contribute to mislead the American people. Meanwhile, Dean, returning to New York, at the time of the impacts of the planes, you had explosions in the sub-basement of each of the buildings that were purportedly caused by jet fuel falling through the elevator shaft. There was damage to the lobby, for example. But the fact of the matter is, there was a temporal discrepancy. This was something Richard talked about. We had a difference in these very modest impacts, which was supposed to be from the planes hitting the building, from the monster impacts for the demolition thereof, where Gordon Ross and Craig Furlong discovered that the original seismic event took place for Flight 11 North Tower, 846.26, but the commission found it at 846.40, a 14-second difference. This was a hand-eye coordination problem, Dean, just as we had with the nose out. And for Flight 175, the seismic was at 9:02.54, but for the commission, 9:03.11, a 17-second difference. When Willie Rodriguez, whom he mentioned as a senior custodian in the North Tower, came here to Madison and gave a presentation, when Kevin Barrett and I took him out to dinner, Willie talked about how the water grew in the sub-basements, which led me to realize that the reason for those explosions was to drain the sprinkler systems that had been installed in the Twin Towers so they could not extinguish the very modest fires that occurred. Now, there are only one or two actual elevators that go all the way down. It's like this was 3 30-story buildings on top of one another with additional floors in between and at the bottom to create 110 total. But if you came down, you'd have to, or went up, you'd have to get up after 30 floors, go on another elevator, get off, and then go on another elevator. There were only a couple of elevator shafts where that could have happened. And Willie explained one of his co-custodians was in one of those elevator shafts, but emerged unscathed. It didn't happen. Meanwhile, what you need to understand is that the Twin Towers were built with a foundation that was below the level of the Hudson River. Therefore, they had to take measures to ensure that the destruction of the building would not damage the kind of dike they had constructed around the sub-basements, which was known as the bathtub. Because if the bathtub were injured, then massive flooding would have occurred beneath lower Manhattan, the bath train troubles of subways, beneath which the most valuable real estate in the world. So they had to find an ingenious design to deal with that, to ensure the bathtub was not destroyed. Now, we know what a classic demolition, controlled demolition looks like. The Building 7, which Richard exposed so clearly, all the floors are coming down at the same time. All the floors are coming down at the same time. And when it's over, there's a pile of debris equal to about 12% of the original height, in that case, 47 floors. Well, look at the Twin Towers. Here's the north. It's not the case. All the floors are coming down at the same time. Instead, The building is blowing apart from the top down. And when it was over, there was no pile of debris. Remember, 12% of 110 floors would have left 13 and a half floors. That would have to have been the case had the buildings collapsed by a kind of pile driver effect that I've already explained was physically impossible because the mass of the upper floors was so modest in relation to the lowers. Had there been an initiation of a collapse, it would have been very partial. It would not have been symmetrical, and it would have ended very, very fast. Meanwhile, again, Chuck Baldwin calculated that the amount of upward force for each unit of downward force was 118. So 118 times more resistant upward than downward. It was a physical impossibility for those buildings to collapse. So what actually happened? Well, look at this. How spectacular can you get? And here you have, of course, Building 7, which only came down 7 hours later at 5:20 after the North Tower had been destroyed following the destruction of the South. Does anyone think we're looking at a collapse of any kind? Clearly not. Thus, and Judy loves this, here we have some of the core column of the North Tower, the core column undergoing molecular dissociation. Something caused the steel to come apart, to dissociate at the molecular level. It happened. It's a fact. Judy wants to suggest this was done by directed energy weapons, but it would have also been an effect of the use of nuclear devices. Meanwhile, the buildings were converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, which enveloped the city. Look at it there. Thus, Donald Trump, the first person in the world to contest the official version of the attacks of 9/11 on television that very day, after having noted the engineers who built the Twin Towers were now working for him, he declared on New York Channel 9 it was impossible that Boeings could have burst through the steel structures of the towers. He continued by stating it was also impossible that Boeings could have caused the towers to collapse. He concluded by affirming that to be other factors of which we were as yet unaware and used the word bombs. Let's listen to the Donald.
Great. Donald, you're probably the best known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation. And it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams. When I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think, you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
You know, Donna, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that there was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, there were very big planes. They were going very rapidly, because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going...
What he's not talking about is pre-positioned explosives. Now, it's interesting with the South Tower, where it tilted to the side, the top section. This was just as 2 firemen were up there saying he thought we could put it out with a couple of lines, and that's when they set it off. It appears to have been done with a mini nuke in the sub-basement that blew the inner tube surrounding the 47 core column from the bottom up, and then had the effect of blowing apart the outer tube from the top down, which is what we observed.
And it's similar to, correct me if I'm wrong, what happened in 1993, Jim, with that bombing of the World Trade Center? Was that a similar beta test back then?
The 93 explosion in the basement, which Donald Trump was talking about, where he got a tour, I believe was conducted to get an analysis of the effects of an explosion on the building. In other words, I believe they had sensors throughout the building, so they used that, which was allegedly to protect the blind sheik in order to do an assessment of the effect of explosives on the building, as they figured out how best to do this without destroying the bathtub, Dean. That's what you got to realize. Without destroying the bathtub. They had destroyed these massive buildings while preserving the bathtub. And here is a very important point to notice. Judy talks about the toasted cars. Richard talked about the toasted cars. Well, the toasted cars would have been an effect of the use of these nukes when it broke through the Faraday cage. The way the buildings were constructed, they were Faraday cages that would have been resistant to any electrical force from the outside. It blocks electromagnetic fields. Judy Wood's theory was impossible for the Twin Towers because their design made them Faraday cages. It could not have happened. Thus, Richard and I are in agreement. Judy Wood's dudes weren't involved in the destruction of 9/11. Moreover, while he touts nanothermite is primarily an incendiary. It attains very high temperatures, but it has very modest explosive effects, only 1/13 the explosive force of TNT. So if you're going to use an explosive to destroy a building, you'd want to use TNT rather than nanothermite, because TNT is 13 times more explosive. Well, we even had a massive steel assembly ejected from the North Tower at a 45-degree angle. Neither DEWs nor nanothermite can explain it, how it's thrown into the Winter Garden, which has been described as where DEWs and nanothermite go to die. Here is a summary of the key scientific facts. Jet fuels fires, even if they burned hot enough and long enough, would cause a building to sag and gradually collapse. Jet fuel could not have ejected 300 tons up at a 45-degree angle and 600 feet outward into the Winter Garden. To explode steel, an explosive needs to have a detonation velocity of 6,100 meters per second. To explode cement, a detonation velocity of 3,200 meters per second. Kerosene, which is a principal constituent of jet fuel, has a detonation velocity of only 1,600 meters per second, but Look at this. Nanothermite has a detonation velocity of only 895 meters per second. You could not have done it with nanothermite. Menonics, however, would have had the observed effects. Now, Richard doesn't want to talk about, Judy had a fit when I pointed this out, but the U.S. Geological Survey did studies of dust samples from 35 locations in Lower Manhattan and found a host of elements that would not have been present had this not been a nuclear event, some of which only exist in radioactive form. That includes barium and strontium, thorium and uranium, lithium, lanthanum, yttrium, chromium, tritium. Meanwhile, also further confirmation, the number of cancer cases among long 9/11 responder tripled to more than 5,400 in less than 3 years. Less than 3 years. Well, today the number is up to closer to 70,000, Dean. And the fact is, the pattern of these medical maladies is the same as that at Chernobyl. You have leukemia, multiple myeloma, esophageal, pancreatic cancer, a whole pattern very similar to what happened at Chernobyl, further confirming that it was a nuclear event. Plus, we had, and this is what you were alluding to before, Dean, the enduring hot temperature beneath the ground. Here you have some hot spots. These endured until mid-December. Now, how could nanothermite have led to all this molten metal that would have endured to mid-December? I submit it could not. And obviously, directed energy weapons had nothing to do with it. But it's a predictable effect of the use of nuclear devices. And here, this is what it looked like when you use a directed energy weapon. This is from Paradise, California. Does the World Trade Center look anything like that, even remotely? Obviously not. Meanwhile, key points about the heat beneath Manhattan. Intense and long-lasting fires. Fires within the debris pile burn for months, contributing to the prolonged heat at the site. High temperature. Thermal measurements taken by helicopter showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 Fahrenheit to over 2,800 Fahrenheit due to the ongoing underground fires. Impact on rescue and recovery. The intense heat at the site posed challenge for workers, melting the soles of their shoes, requiring careful consideration for the safety of search and rescue dogs. Thermal hotspots. Initial analysis of thermal data from September 16th revealed numerous thermal hotspots in the region where the WTC building collapsed with temperatures greater than 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Some cooled over the following days, but others endured to mid-December. Now, here's what a collapse looked like. This is in Pakistan, I surmise. This was an ordinary concrete building collapsing. We know, therefore, when Building 7 came down, and Richard was very thorough about this, we had a classic controlled demolition. All the floors were coming down at the same time, and they left a stack of debris equal to 12% original height, 5.5 floors, as seen here. Now look, here you got that pile of debris, 5.5 floors from Building 7. But here's where Building 1, the North Tower, stood. If there'd been a collapse, there should be 13.5 floors of debris. And I dare say nanothermite would have left a massive pile as well. It's not there because the building was converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust, which incidentally is a signature of the use of nuclear devices. Meanwhile, Barry Jennings, whom Richard mentioned, went to Building 7. Rudy Giuliani had 2 floors there with their own air and water. When he arrived, he found half-eaten sandwiches, still steaming cups of coffee. A fireman came along and said, "We got to get you out of here." While he was inside the building, he heard explosions take place. He had a stairwell collapse under him. At one point, he felt himself stepping over dead people. Though in the blackness, he couldn't see it. When he emerged, he gave an interview. One of the major faults of the 9/11 Commission was it didn't address Building 7. So they had to undertake a whole complete separate analysis. Just 2 days before it was released, Barry Jennings, who was in a position to contradict its findings that the collapse of Building 7 had been from very modest fires, died mysteriously. And I'll tell you, before 9/11, after 9/11, on 9/11, no steel structure high rise in history has ever collapsed because of fire, ever. Rudy Giuliani, as I say, lined up all those dump trucks. I'll tell you, in New York, it would probably take you a month to line up one dump truck. He had 115 lined up. Rudy was deeply involved. It was election day in New York. He thought he was going to become America's mayor, a hero, and remain in office, who knows, indefinitely in his own mind. Meanwhile, Jane Stanley of the BBC committed a colossal blooper. At 4:57, she reported that the Solomon Brothers building had collapsed, except that, another name for Building 7, it was still standing. And you could see it over her left shoulder, or right. There it is. What a blunder. The BBC has never been able to explain. They got ahead of the script. And I mean that literally. They got ahead of the script. Meanwhile, what was going on here? Well, in 1991, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the neocons believed this was an ideal opportunity to create a new American empire that would endure for the next 100 years. Meanwhile, Bibi Netanyahu was thinking through a plan of how to draw American military forces into the Middle East to take out the modern Arab states that served as a counterbalance to Israel's domination of the entire region. He held a conference, published a book, Terrorism, How the West Can Win, when the concept of terrorism was still only dim in the consciousness of the West. Richard Burrell, Paul Wolfowitz, eager to promote the American empire. They were deeply involved. Plus, the Project for a New American Century was publishing again and again about the importance of seizing the opportunity provided by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, including passages from Rebuilding America's Defenses reading as follows: the process of transformation, meaning the emergence of the U.S. as a world empire, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Domestic politics and industrial policy will shape the pace and content of transformation as much as the requirements of current missions. They had to move forward to have a new Pearl Harbor. Just as we were reporting, we heard already the very day of the event, where Wesley Clark would eventually explain what was going on at the Commonwealth Club in California on October 3rd, 2007. He had visited the Pentagon shortly after 9/11 and encountered a general there. And the general informed him, Wesley asked, what are we planning to do? He said, well, we're going to invade, attack Iraq. And Wesley Clark said, Iraq? Or Was it Afghanistan? He said they had nothing to do with 9/11, and the general agreed. Clark came back weeks later, and he encountered the same general. He said, well, are we still planning to invade Afghanistan? And he said, oh, General, it's much worse. Step into my office. I've just received a memorandum from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld that we're going to take out the governments of 7 countries in the next 5 years, including Iraq and Libya, ending with Syria and Iran. And that, of course, is a project on which we embarked. Clark said, well, is it classified? And the general said, yes. Well, Clark said, then don't show it to me because I may want to talk about it. But they both agreed this was bizarre. And they asked, why are we doing this? And the general said, I don't know, sir. I guess we're just good at it. Meanwhile, here's a man who I believe wrote the script. His name, Philip Zelikow. When they organized the 9/11 Commission, which Bush and Cheney had opposed for 441 days, but under pressure of the Jersey girls, widows of men who had died at the World Trade Center, they finally succumbed. They invited Henry Kissinger to be the director, but Kissinger declined because he would have had to explain his financial entanglements. His successor, Philip Zelikow, who had as his area of academic specialization the creation and maintenance of public myths, MYTHS. Philip Zelikow, I submit, wrote the script for 9/11. He had a draft of the 9/11 Commission report complete a year before he shared it with the staff. Today, he's a member of the Department of History at the University of Virginia. I give you the script writer for 9/11 based upon all my research. He fits the qualification to a T. Plus, they had to find a way to block legal action. They relied upon Alvin K. Hellerstein for the district court in the Southern District of New York. He has blocked all those efforts, including by Judy Wood, which I applaud and supported, to move forward on behalf of Israel. Here we have the masterminds, Ehud Olmert and Bibi Netanyahu, who designed the plan to draw American forces into the Middle East to benefit Israel and the Greater Israel Project, which many believe is continuing today with the ongoing assaults on Iran, with the fall of Syria, which is now governed by a former IDF. In case you hadn't noticed, 6 of the 7 countries have fallen. Only Iran remains. And finally, Dick Cheney. Michael Rupert, in his book, Crossing the Rubicon, established based on publicly available sources that Dick Cheney was the executive director of 9/11 from a bunker underneath the White House. Bush played a role, but he was largely kept out of the loop because he was untrustworthy, and after all, he just wasn't that smart. If you want more, check it out. America Nuked on 9/11. Compliments of the CIA, the neocons in the Department of Defense, and the Mossad. Thank you.
All right. Jim, thank you for that. I have a few questions, and I might feel if you have time, maybe we can field a question or two from the actual live chat. And
Sure.
How about that, everybody? Just a round of applause for Jim Fetzer's incredible 9/11 presentation. You know, Richard has his work ahead of him for this coming Saturday, Jim. And if you want to catch that, by the way, we'll get Jim's take on it, is Saturday, you're going to see the big debate between Fetzer versus Gage. But Jim, a few questions right off of the bat. Why do all the most evil men in the world, how come they all have just humongous ears? You know, like this guy here. We see it with Bibi Netanyahu. I mean, has anyone seen the trend with that lately? Just a first thing that comes to mind. But you mentioned the security apparatus around the towers, and you said it was an Israeli firm. And all this time I thought it was, and maybe you can help me explain the Marvin Bush angle to it.
Well,
I thought, was he not in charge?
There were actually two different firms that were involved, and Bush was tied in with one and the Israelis the other, but they all were working in concert, Dean, to control the World Trade Center and enable this to take place.
Very interesting. Then we talked about hot molten lava everywhere, of course. And, to give some validity to that, I had interviewed Michelle Little. You want to maybe tackle that angle, because she really is the first that talks about not only how the soles of her shoes 2 weeks later were getting melted, but she saw the gold heist. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? A lot of people mentioned that in the chat.
Well, Dean, yeah, there was a massive supply of gold beneath the World Trade Center that was looted in advance. I mean, that was yet one more motive. Peripheral, of course, since the primary were political and military, but the looting did take place, no question about it. And by the way, there were some peripheral events. Fuji Bank, for example, had a whole series of batteries on their floor. And when the batteries melted, you had a flow of liquid that some, such as Steve Jones, have claimed was molten steel, but it wasn't. It was just molten lead from the batteries. There was a point where Steve and I had a conflict in Chandler, Arizona, and I was reluctant to speak what I took to be the case, namely that he was citing evidence that was not legitimate in support of his position. But I'm willing to say it today, that the account you've got here, and remember, this is a result of collaboration. When I founded Scholars, I brought together hundreds of experts from all around the world: pilots, engineers, structural, mechanical, electrical, aeronautical, physicists, brought them together. We had 4 different categories of membership, and we were very, very successful. But when I began interviewing Judy Wood in November that year, Steve Jones, Kevin Ryan, and others decided I'd wandered off the nanothermite reservation, which I'd given up on. I hadn't believed nanothermite since early in 2006. I thought it was a preposterous theory. Richard mentioned how T. Mark Hightower, as a chemical engineer, and I published 3 different stories about articles about nanothermite in 2011, one of which was appropriately entitled "Is 9/11 Truth?" based upon a false theory. Well, I submit nanothermite was then and remains a false theory. You can't do what they want to do with a mechanism that only has a detonation velocity of 895 meters per second.
Okay, a couple quick more questions before we get out of here. We have people on Rumble who are saying, we have Dame Pam asking, was gold stored under these towers? I would say yes, they were.
There was a Federal Reserve Bank. There was a Federal Reserve Bank vault there, full of gold. Yes, 100%.
So there you go. Okay, we have Mr. Watland over there on Rumble saying.
By the way, there was a film. Die Hard film.
Die Hard 3, yes.
Die Hard 3 that actually shows the
exact plot. Yes, good point. And actually, one of my favorites of this series, thank you for mentioning, we have Mr. Watland on Rumble saying, Larry Fine studied the bedrock. It was extremely hot. Yes, it was. We have a lot of people. We have a truer one over there on Rumble saying, excellent work, Jim. Thank you. We have Film TV Biz saying 18 U.S. Code, 2381 treason. I would say so. And we have also this one, Manx Cat saying over there on YouTube, we don't even know what happened to Facebook, everybody. Hopefully, if you're watching there, they've been tinkering with us, saying all the companies who moved out just before 9/11. Never heard about that. Thank you for mentioning that. I'll try to bring that to Saturday night. We have 9/11/27 saying thermite was used to bring down the Reichstag roof in 1054 in the Skyride Tower in 1919. Thank you for that wonderful history. We have Skip Tumalu saying, you're being targeted when 9/11 hangs up, guys, trying to get the divorce now. Yeah, I know we're above the target, as they say here. And then we'll end on this one here. We have Celtic Girl saying that this is the only second time I've heard someone say images of the planes were not real, although many of the whole event was staged. Jim, here's a question from me because I find it very interesting. I want to talk about the blackmail of the rogue country from the Middle East here, because I started writing articles 10 years ago about the blackmail of Bill Clinton at behest of Bibi starting in 95. What about the blackmail of Bush during this time? Was it a blackmail that allowed this event to happen, or was it, in addition to that, a blackmail that allowed us or forced us into the Iraqi war?
Well, Dean, they had to steal the election in Florida where Jeb was the president in order to bring in Bush and Cheney to give us 9/11 and the Patriot Act, which consolidated 35 agencies of government into a monolith. Those agencies were competing for intelligence. It's well known that if you have different agencies competing, you're more likely to learn the truth, that you only want a consolidation if you want to have a single voice speaking, and that it was even modeled after the Stasi, these German secret police, known to be among the most efficient in the world. So our own form of government in terms of the executive branch was altered, and the laws of the nation were affected by the Patriot Act and the reorganization to create an Department of Homeland Security. It should all be undone, Dean. If it were to be undone, return to the previous organization, we'd be leap years ahead of where we are now. The Patriot Act has to be revoked. It has to be rescinded. Measures like that would make a real difference.
And, thinking back to that time, everybody, the only voices I heard in the wilderness around the time of the Patriot Act's enrollment into our lives were people like Ron Paul, former congressman, and Dennis Kucinich that comes to mind. So not a lot of voices back then compared to today. Jim, as we now waltz into Saturday night for the live debate between you and Richard, give us some of your final thoughts and maybe what to expect from this debate, because Richard is a fierce opponent and made an incredible, compelling case, Jim, as you did.
It's going to be very cordial. I like Richard. I respect what he did with architects and engineers. He drew tremendous attention to the Achilles heel of 9/11, which is Building 7. Wasn't hit by any plane, only suffered very modest fires. It was impossible that it could have collapsed. He did a wonderful job exposing the fraud of Building 7. I admire that. I'm all on his side as far as that goes. Our differences concern how the Twin Towers were destroyed. And of course, I'll be fascinated to hear what Richard has to say about the various plane crashes and who is responsible and why, which I faulted both him and Judy Wood for many, many years, Dean, that neither Judy Wood and Dews nor architects and engineers would address who is responsible and why. Well, without that context, these debates about how it was done, nanothermite, directed energy nukes, all appear to be abstract hocus pocus to the American people. They don't mean anything absent the context. So no doubt Richard will respond on that point.
Yes, he will. And Jim, he's a fierce opponent. And come Saturday, too, I will, as the moderator, I'll also try to represent the DEW factor when we get to that segment, because Judy is not available for this. And I mean, if she is, you can have her email me. I don't know her personally if she will show up, but I will try to represent the DEW argument to my best ability to it. Okay, so Jim Fetzer, Jim, I know what a presentation. You need to rest up for Saturday, and Jim will be joining me tomorrow night with a special presentation here from Real Deal Media, as we do a Real Deal Media live on just all the platforms, and he'll be training and just doing the He's going to be. How many push-ups are you doing for this event now, Jim? You are ready for this Saturday night. I've seen him. He
Very
is
nice.
Headband and all. Just he is the
Very
man
nice.
with the plan. So thank you very much, Jim Fetzer. There you have it, right there. He is a trainer. He's getting strong now, just like Rocky. Okay, we're going to now leave it there. I want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight as this extended edition of such an event here. Again, don't miss Saturday night, 9 p.m. Eastern. I will be there in bow tie and all, or referee shirt. I'm not sure yet. Okay, for Jim Fetzer, for Richard Gage, and everyone else here at Real Deal Media, I'm Dean Ryan. Who's saying thank you for being here as we have to continue carrying the torch of one of the most darkest days in world history, not just American history, because right now 9/11 seem to be happening over and over and over again in every part of the world. And this was the day and the event that just changed the country forever, sadly. And if you were not there before 9/11 and all those years, well, we have the duty and the responsibility to carry on the tradition of what the world used to be like. So until next time, always remember to stay tuned and stay awake. A good night, everybody. See you tomorrow night.